Hello guys, time again for theoretical lecture. Lately when I play against Accelerated Dragon, always a very annoying line because it's full of very subtle things by black that you have to know with the white pieces in order to reach the advantage. And then I hate it so much. I realized that most of my students have problems with the order of moves. When should they play bishop c4, when to avoid f3, because they have some threats with queen b6 and so many other things. They don't waste time for d6, they immediately do d5. And I just realized, let's be the ones who's going to be in the driver's seat. Let's be the ones who's going to say, okay, let's go. We're going to direct the things. We're going to be the, just like I said, the drivers. And I found it. It's Hungarian variation with h4. It's nothing new because I used to play the Hungarian, actually accelerated dragon myself. So Hungarian variation happens after e4, c5, knight f3, g6. And then this is accelerated dragon. We're pretty much, how should I say, fed up with all those long theoretical lines that you have to remember, and you just want to go with a little bit of crazy stuff. And there we go, Hungarian line h4. An obvious idea behind h4 is to push this pawn up to h5 and to take on g6, in which case rook on h8 would be open. You would have to take by f-pawn, and that would be a great thing for us. That's why when we play h4, they just have to avoid it. They just have to allow it, so avoid it with h5, allow it with bishop g7, and basically those two moves are the most important moves to know there. Since I used to be the accelerated dragon player, I know that the knight f6 has to be known well because it's the engine approach. And I don't know, those who like some sort of reactions in the center, we should cover d5. So let's get ready for 4 main approaches by black. I would go with d5 first because it's kind of Scandinavian. It's kind of Acopian approach just without the pawn on c3. Well, that is a difference, but that is a huge difference because without the pawn on c3, now we have a very easy knight c3 with the tempo. Early knight f6 to be able to delay, to decide whether they want to take by queen or by knight later and when to do it is usually bad because of h5. And h5 just opens the h file. We threaten to take on g6, and when they play knight h5, we just go with d4. I would say that this was one of those moments when you play h5 to force their knight to take on h5, to kind of put it to be stranded on the right side of the board, and it's not controlling the center. So basically, when you play like this, it's a very nice and lovely line here for white. For example, they take, you take. They grab on d5 and they say, okay, we're up a pawn. Man, you're up a pawn, but I'm up regarding development. Knight c3, bishop b5, I'm queen f3. I'm threatening on b7, on f7. I'm able to capture afterwards. I always going to consider some rook h5 ideas, bishop d2 with ideas, either long or short castle. It really looks good for white. And that's why I believe that most of these guys who play d5 will take by queen, and that's a huge difference in comparison to the Acopian variation. Now the knight can come easily on c3 with tempo. You play h5, and you know what? With 2 minor pieces developed, and the main developing pieces, and those are knights, with the open h file and the fact that we already pushed our pawn to h5 and we're now threatening to take on g6, in which case f takes g6 would be disastrous by black, they just have to go with bishop g7, and you go like this. This early bishop c4 is aimed against any bishop g4 because of bishop f7 and knight g5, in which case you get a pawn and break their castle. So when they play knight c6, you play d3. And once again, they can play bishop g4 because of the same trick. So when they play like knight f5, you always have this bishop b5 checks. When they go knight f6, and you know what? I've been playing these positions for all these years from black's point of view. And I know how difficult it is when they have this stupid pawn on h5. Because you finally have to do something. And usually you react by jumping with your knight on f6 and then h6. And h6 comes as one of a natural, but at the same time, very annoying ideas by white because you harass this bishop on g7. Now, when they go back, you play queen e2. You go after the f7 pawn. You control the center. Everything is just so good, and you're just so fine. After a6, bishop a3. We want to play like long castle followed by d4. I just played a blitz game once, 94. Looks like we're losing a piece, but actually this one saves the day. That's an intermediary move that is so strong because once they play bishop d7, we just take on d4 and they're simply fallen apart. That's what you have to know, and that's what you have to do there. Then third move, knight f6. In the intro of this lecture, I just told you that we have to cover knight f6 very carefully because it's one of the engine approaches. I played against one guy who's also accelerated dragon player. Then he played h4 against me, and I easily, with knight f6, from black's point of view, got an advantage. And that's why I insist we gotta be very precise and to know what to do with the white pieces when knight f6 happens. You play e5. Any knight e5 is just, I would say, kind of illusional for black because you just break with h5. You threaten to take on g6 and to open the h file. You know how that is good. Bishop g7, and once again that famous h6 that somehow gives us tempo. And after they go bishop f8, you play d4. Now you're opening up the center. You're opening up the bishops. They have this pawn on h6 as an extremely annoying piece into the black's game. And I really have to say that the following position should be considered at least a lot better for white, if not even more. Also, consider that we're way better regarding development here. And finally, after e5, knight g4. Knight g4 is the idea which goes after the pawn on e5, and we go with d4. d4 breaks the center, fights for the open bishops, fights for the center. We want to take by queen. I want to show you a game between Vladimir Acopian, 2700 GM from Armenia, and William Pascal from United States, and I am good player who was lost in 3 moves from now with the black piece. Acopian played d4. This guy, Pascal, played knight c6. And after d5, knight e5, knight e5, knight e5, f4, and he trapped his knight. It's a really funny way to lose piece. He did something very interesting here. I guess he really wanted this position to play for 3 pawns and probably for the broken king, and then he played queen c7. And here Acopian did something even nicer. He didn't immediately take. He first pushed this pawn, opened up the d5 jumping square for the knight, and after queen d6, took on e5, played knight c3, and had completely winning games against an IM in 12 moves. That game took part somewhere in the United States back to 1999. And finally, when you play d4, simply they have to behave like, okay, we're gonna play bishop g7, and let's see what is white going to do. Here you have 2 options. First one is knight g5. It's an engine option. You threaten the knight, and somehow you go, I don't know, with after f7 pawn, you want to go with h5, breaking along the h file. They all go with h5, bishop c4, threatening pawn on f7. They all go castles. And I found some games where players went for queen d3, and that's a mistake because when they manage to break your center with c takes d4 and knight e5, you're just simply falling apart and you're going to lose the game. So you either have to be very tricky and very tactical and very direct, or you just have to like throw the towel into the ring from an early like fight here. So after like f3, kicking the knight away, knight h6, and now d5. I like this move. G4 is interesting, but it's not as efficient as this d5. You sack a pawn and you play knight c3. You don't care if they play bishop g3, you just move your king. and carry on with the attack. Also, let's be honest, the dark square bishop should be around its king and to control the dark squares, not to weaken your king, because I don't even see why would our king be a weak piece in this case. I actually consider it good. I want to jump somewhere 96 to go after this knight. I want to go with queen to d3, maybe d6 to open up this bishop and go after the king on g8. I want to go after the pawn on g6 and do stuff like this. After like d6, knight e6. Knight e6 with the idea to open up this bishop, to go after all these pieces, but basically you just go with it because you want to take the knight on h6. And now this is very difficult for them because we threaten the rook. The rook has to go here because on rook f7 you just take with tempo. So they go with rook f5, and the very important move is this one. Very important move is not g4 because of bishop g3, but queen d2. And if they play bishop g3, king d1, and somehow they have problems with e6, and they have problems to take because we take by knight. And they have problems because we're threatening knight e2 to go after the dark square bishop and to go with some sort of activity and action on the king's side. White simply looks a lot better, and even though engine says it's winning for white, I wouldn't go that far, but I'd say certainly white is the one who's a lot better here. And finally, in this line, after knight f6, e5, knight g4, d4, bishop g7, you go with that gambit move d5. And after, by the way, you go with that knight g5, h5, bishop here, and you can go with gambiting move d5. But you can immediately go with the gambiting sixth move d5, which Bacro played against a good theoretician from Brazil, Mkhitaryan. Mkhitaryan captured the pawn. Bacro played h5, threatening to take here, d6, and no, he didn't take there. That's a little bit surprising. He played knight d2, giving him an option of jumping with a knight on both squares, chasing that bishop away from the center. And after castle, played bishop d3, played queen f3. Probably he wanted to reposition that queen to the h file, possibly. And after e5, h takes, f takes, queen g3, and he came up with this idea, and he was easily winning. Mkhitaryan played this. After rook g7, he went into this position, and afterwards, against the bishop pair, once you open up your rook and bring it somehow into the h file, Bacro was easily winning already. So just like you see, the line itself is full of interesting options. Let's go for one of the main moves, bishop g7, and then I'm going to show you what's happening after h5. If they go with bishop g7, you just have to go with h5. Of course, that's our main intention. Once again, that classic knight f6 doesn't work because of famous h6, e5, and d4. And I don't want to discuss these positions with you. I mean, I found so many games, and all these games were won by white. But simply, for example, most logical thing, they take you capture by queen, you threaten the knight. They go e6, you kick the knight away. They play knight c6, bring it back, doesn't matter. Play bishop f4, knight c3, play queen d2, long castles. You have a pawn on h6 that weakens the king, that weakens the dark squares. They can't play d6. This is like so terrible position. Engine went too far and says this is winning for white. And once again, I wouldn't go that far. I once again would say much better for white, with the tendency to easily go into winning game. And that's why after h5, probably the most flexible thing is knight c6. And I'm going to reveal a secret to you. I used to be a accelerated dragon player for all these years. So I'm playing this in standard games very often, even nowadays. And I was taught, when I analyzed these positions and when I tried to realize what am I supposed to play against this h4, I always somehow relied on this bishop g7, knight c6 plan. Like, let's keep it flexible. Any h takes g6, black should recapture by h1 and keep the flexibility. But you know what? When they play developing, but seemingly nothing that special, knight c3, and when they play bishop c4, now we're in some sort of, I'm going to use like Zugzwang, in terms of what are we going to do with the knight on g8? That's very frustrating for the black players, believe me. And if I want to go with knight f6, then you're going to push this pawn to h6, earn that tempo. I got to go back, and then you immediately open up the game because you're happy to open up the game like this. I played a game once with a white pieces, blitz bishop g5, queen d2, bishop b3, and play like this. I'm much better because d6 always turns out to be weak. They can never play d5, and I can slowly increase and push my position onto the king side. Then apart from this, for example, instead of knight f6, let's say they don't want to play knight f6. They play knight h6, like everything is cool. Well, looks like, but I'm going to play d3. They go bishop g4, and position looks okay at first glance for them. But here, bishop to d2. The point of this bishop to d2 is that they now have problems. With the bishop d2, I want to go with some queen c1 even in some lines. If they take on h5, I'm immediately going to sack my rook for the bishop, go with the knight g5, threatening on f7, threatening on h5, and go with the queen h5, and we're just dominating once again. And e6 doesn't work due to bishop e6. If they just play rook f8, we're just gonna go on h7 and hanging this one as well. Then I don't know. This is just so much better position. If not, it's completely winning for white. And then they can't play knight f6. They can hardly go with knight h6. G takes h5 is something that engine likes, but humans don't like these kinds of moves. You just play knight e2 and you just want to grab it. First of all, you want to play d3 and c3 and get like kinds of flexible position where you shut off the activity of the bishop on g7, and you go with the d3, you go with the c3, and afterwards you just want to place your knight somewhere, for example, bishop g5, knight g3, knight f4, and grab the pawn back on h5 once you feel like it's appropriate thing. It's okay, and white is just slightly better. Once again, g takes h5 is not typically human move, and I don't think your opponents will go for that. And finally, most of these guys who feel like kind of danger of that position, they go e6, d3, because unfortunately we cannot do everything in this position and we cannot even play d4. So we play d3, bishop e3, and now I wish I could go with d4, but I cannot, and that's why they actually, if you can play d4, then everything is fantastic. You develop the bishop, you're gonna break in the center, you just push your pawn to h5 there, so your position is just so good. So I'm not saying that they should play g takes h5, I'm just saying pawn on h5 is good, bishop on c4 is good. If you manage to do d4, then you're amazing. So after bishop e3, knight d4, just challenge this knight with the knight b5. Challenge it with the knight b5. They can't play queen a5 because of bishop d2. They shouldn't take on b5 because we take with check, and afterwards we're gonna play c3 and shut off the activity of the bishop and kind of close it and soften up the diagonal there. So everything looks fine for white in this type of positions, and of course that you should analyze these positions a little bit more, maybe play some games, maybe play with your friends, or you set up this position on your phone or engine and just play against the computer to know like the basic tricks. That could be a way for training. And finally, h5. That's the most common thing in this position because they behave like, if you can play h4 in such an early stage of the game and play against me this Hungarian variation, I can play h5, I can play the same way. Well, are you sure, buddy? So then you just go with d4, breaking in the center and playing this d4. And they take, and then you develop your bishop on c4, going after the pawn on f7, and now you're just deciding whether you want to take on d4 by knight, whether you want to jump with the knight on d4 and doing stuff like this. So I'm showing the game between Grandmaster Villa Rodriguez and Bent Larsen. Take a look at this game, you're gonna like it so much. Bent Larsen played knight c6. I analyzed in this position bishop g7, which is one of the most typical things. And here you play in a good Smith-Morra fashion. Why good? Because they already committed themselves with g6. And all you guys who like Smith-Morra, you will know that we kind of go with c3 in these positions, and it's very likely to be a very nice position for white. So after c3, if they take, you capture by knight, play queen b3, they go knight a5, a typical way of going. Then you go bishop f7, queen d5, they go knight f6, and everybody will take your piece like this. You bring your queen here to eye the pawn on g6, knight g5, and then you play e5. You're eyeing the knight on f6, eyeing the pawn g6, and even d5 square. After knight g4, d5, knight e6, knight g5, and just like you see, I am just showing you the game, a correspondence game, played like 40 years ago, but here, after bishop e3, very nice move to go with the bishop c5, if takes, f takes, and you can go rook f1 or just short castle, and the king is gonna get mated. The guy played king e8, short castle, f takes, knight b5, going all over the board, and this guy was badly beaten, and he resigned here. European Championship in correspondence chess like 40 years ago. Very nice. I enjoyed this game a lot, and this is how you should be playing these positions. And finally, I'm showing you the game between Bent Larsen and Rodriguez Villa, Amador Rodriguez Villa from Uruguay, the guy who had white here, very attractive chess player, tactical player. Bent played knight c6, but keep in mind, Bent Larsen, he was a legendary second player of the world, and he got badly beaten here. Of course, Smith-Morra approach, and this guy captured. Probably black should be going with some e6 ideas, but okay, then you play c takes d4 and you play normal game where we gotta consider that they committed themselves more with h5 than we committed ourselves with h4. So d takes, knight f6, and you just play in the Smith-Morra fashion. After d6, played knight g5, went for the pawn on f7, e6, played knight b5, went for the pawn on d6. Now you can't play e5 because bishop f7. Now you can't play knight e5 because take, queen d8, and knight f7, winning the rook. And basically after knight b5, Bent Larsen, do you know what is funny thing? Bent Larsen was one of the most legendary players ever. He was second player of the world when Robert James Fischer played. And Bent Larsen here got outplayed in 10 moves. I mean, it's crazy. With such a seemingly stupid line, Hungarian variation, he was lost in 10 moves. So Bent Larsen played a6, knight e6, bishop d6, played queen a5. A very interesting line was given after this. He would have gone with bishop e5, threatening knight and the rook. And after queen d1, rook d1, knight e8, he said rook d8. He calculated during the game, king e2, to go rook h to d1. But if you take this on d8, you're just falling apart after this and knight h8. So after like queen a5, b4, very lovely thing. If knight b4, you earn tempo for the safe king. And after queen d8, Amador Rodriguez played rook to h3, goes with this rook to d3 or f3. After knight g4, bishop b3, queen d2, bishop goes back to c4, playing rook to d1, and after bishop c5, he just took on e6, won the pawn back. This is like clearly winning position for white. He was up a pawn, he had a bishop pair, and everything in this position was working really, really well. After rook d8, Amador played rook to d3, and Bent Larsen after queen b5, bishop d6, and queen a4 was so many pawns down and simply resigned the game. Hope that you like this short presentation of the Hungarian variation against Accelerated Dragon, and I'm pretty sure that from now on, if you learn this line to play with the white pieces, you're going to be a very annoying players for your opponents who decide to play against you, Accelerated Dragon. Stay on the channel, tell your friends about it, subscribe, and sometimes donate. Bye bye.